Oh, thanks, Kevin, and thanks everyone for joining me. You can embarrassingly see the top and bottom of my PowerPoint slides there. But hi, welcome to my 4.5-hour talk. Since Kevin said I have all the time in the world, I'm kidding. My name's Kestral. My cat has now decided this is a fantastic opportunity to interrupt. So this is Compton, who is my cat. Who will be doing his absolute best to cause havoc while I'm talking. You go over there. There you go. And I'm here to talk a little bit about ethics in technology this evening. So I've kind of subtitled my talk "Doing the Right Thing in a World of Hallucinating Robots" because this week, in fact, having planned this talk for ages, OpenAI gave us a little ethical dilemma with the release of GPT-4. And one of the issues with GPT-4, as they describe it, is that the robot still hallucinates, in that it can often take you off on flights of fancy and give you wildly inaccurate answers and completely invent quotes by people just because it thinks that's what you want to hear. But it does it very convincingly, which is an interesting ethical dilemma in and of itself. So whether you are working in tech, or you're writing a book, ethics is something that impacts all of us, and yet is something that we don't really talk about very often. So I kind of work at the intersection of people and technology. I spent a lot of time working in tech companies over a number of years. Then I kind of retrained and respecialized in things like psychotherapy and psychology, and now find myself teaching technology and ethics at a small university in London called the London Interdisciplinary School. It's very new. We're one of these kind of startup universities that's challenging the idea of what higher education means. So we don't have entry requirements for grades. We interview literally everyone that applies. The idea is that really the best way to learn is in an interdisciplinary way. You can solve complex problems by thinking about a little bit of everything, and that doing really badly in an exam, and let's face it, ChatGPT can take exams now, so they're not really that good a measure of what someone actually knows, is not that important. Actually, what's important is passion and tenacity and having ideas around changing the world. So I've got the real privilege of teaching there as one of my day jobs, and I focus on ethics in technology and really ethical frameworks and how to build thoughts around ethics into things you do, whether it's trying to solve the climate crisis or whether it's trying to cook a meal for a family member that you hate. There are ethical ways of doing all of those things, and I would say if you're cooking a meal for a family member that you hate, the unethical thing to do is add the poison. The ethical thing to do is make them something that you know they'll like. So just in case there's anyone on the call that needs to hear that. So where are we right now? It's 2023, okay? We're in this magical year in the 21st century. We are 23 years past the year 2000. We are somehow in the future. The 20s is 100 years ago and also right now. And so technology has evolved beyond all recognition from where it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. In fact, the first talk this evening, in the Q&A afterwards, I heard Kevin mention that even just doing things as they were done 5 years ago when thinking about running Node is so different now, and that we have to get out of those kind of old habits. And if the world has changed that much in 5 years, how do you think it's changed in the last 50? And in 2023, we live in this world where we're surrounded by ads, and these ads seem to follow us. Every single person I talk to will get an ad at some point on their phone, and they say, holy crap, this app must have been listening to me because I had a conversation with one person about this 3 days ago, and now all of my adverts on Instagram are flooded with it. Obviously, that's not how it happens, but algorithmic intelligence has got to the point where adverts service everything that we need as we need it, sometimes to dangerous effects, and we'll talk about that in a minute. VR is becoming a bigger thing, so is AR. Headsets are getting better. The metaverse, whether you like it or not, is a thing that exists. And who owns that experience? But when you're in the real world, in the world that's around us right now, and yes, I know there are papers about whether the entire world is a simulation or not. For now, let's say that this is reality. When I'm in reality, I kind of have a bit of control over that experience. I've got a screen in front of me right now, but I could yeet it off my balcony if it really upset me that much. I've got a cat in front of me right now. I could choose to either stroke him or ignore him. I'm going to stroke him a little bit because, you know, he's a cute cat. But I control the experience around me. But if you're programming someone's entire VR experience, you own their world. Everything from the sound the ground makes that someone walks on when they're in VR, right through to the color of the sky, all of that is controllable by you. If you're designing a VR experience for someone, you control their whole world. GPT-4 and similar sort of technologies around artificial and algorithmic intelligence are not just allowing us to generate incredibly fantastic memes on things like ChatGPT, but also are sparking huge ethical debates in the fields of art and anything creative where people's work is being fed into these machines. And then AI apps like DALL-E are able to generate new images, but they're all iterative based on other people's work without any accreditation. We also live in a world that is full of devices, right? A few years ago, I would give talks and say, we now have, you know, devices in our pockets that are more powerful than NASA was in 1969. But they're not just in our pockets anymore. My Apple Watch is a few generations old, and it is incredibly powerful as a piece of technology. Its computing power is beyond things that we had 30 or 40 years ago. We carry devices with us everywhere, from smart rings to smartphones. We have fridges that can form zombie botnet armies. Our washing machines can talk to us via Wi-Fi, and my cat can scratch at the screen, but not if I move him over there. So we are in a place where technology defines everything. It talks to us about how we think. It defines how we experience the world. It impacts the way that we create and the way that we live. Everything about our existence is intrinsically linked with technology. And sometimes, as you know, as I'm sure most of you are aware, technology is layered and layered and layered. And one experience could have had hundreds of thousands of people contributing to it in ways they don't even realize. There are times where I wonder that whether the world will just collapse if one person stops updating one repo that's a packet that's given out in a package manager that then is a small part of a small thing that's a small part of a bigger thing. And technology is like that. And we don't necessarily think about the tiny things that we do and the ethical implications they may have. When I worked at Microsoft a really long time ago, we were kind of scattergunning quite a lot of different technology at the time, but there was never talk around end user ethics and how that might be used. There was lots of great marketing speak. And I'm sure there was an ethics team dealing with that somewhere in the company. But as someone working on a product or a dev kit for a product, I didn't know what that was. And I was going out on the road talking to developers saying, hey, build on top of this product. But I didn't know what the ethics team had thought about, whether they had done their homework or not. And it just wasn't built into my vocabulary at the time. And that's why it's really important that we start to think about ethics. Actually, it is about ethics, but it's about ethics in technology. So how have we not questioned these things before? And the answer is we kind of have, but I don't think we really knew what we were questioning. It's 2023 now, but back in 1966, two things were happening. England did some sports thing that a lot of people got really happy about. But in America, someone wrote a piece of software called ELIZA. And ELIZA was the first attempt at a natural language program for computers. It was ported to a bunch of different platforms. This screenshot's from the Commodore 64 version. I had it, obviously not in the 60s. I'm not that old, but I had it on a DOS-based PC. And ELIZA was essentially a psychotherapist. And it employed Rogerian psychotherapy, which is basically help people to help themselves by asking them questions and getting them to provide the answers. So it didn't need any medical knowledge. All it needed was the ability to ask people to reflect on the things they'd just said. And it did that relatively well. And at the time, in the 60s, there were reams of articles talking about whether or not ELIZA could convince people that it was human. Now, in the chat after this, I'm going to paste a link to an online version of ELIZA that exists now. You'll use it for 30 seconds and you'll agree there is no way that you could ever think that it was human. But that's by our standards today. In the 60s, this was revolutionary, particularly given as technology was in its infancy. I mean, people were using this on terminals attached to giant great computers. And it was an incredible application that was able to be realized as a result of it. And the conversation then came along, well, could something like this pass the Turing test? Now, the Turing test, named because it was devised by gay icon and queer celebrity pop sensation Alan Turing, was named because he postulated that a computer could be deemed artificially intelligent as long as a human questioner couldn't tell the difference between a computer and a human replying to a question. Now, that doesn't mean consciousness. So it's really interesting here that a lot of people are very worried about technological singularities. There's an amazing paper by Werner Vinge that I can point you to on that if you're more interested. And I teach my students a lot about that. But technology only really has to be good enough to fool a human. And as we all know, humans are quite easy to fool. So can we develop technology that is intelligent enough to convince a human questioner that a computer respondent and a human respondent are the same thing? This is kind of why the film was called The Imitation Game, because this was a lot of what Alan Turing worked on in his later years. So this is something that technology has used for years. Television is not video. We call it a movie because it's moving images. They don't actually move. You're just seeing 25 or 30 or 60 different still images a second, but they move just quickly enough to convince your brain that it is, in fact, moving. There's no magic video. It is all just still images. And that's how screens work. That's how TVs have worked since they were invented. And it's really interesting that this pervasiveness of stuff working just enough to fool us, just enough to make us think it's doing a thing, is how a lot of technology works. We call it smoke and mirrors. We call it minimum viable products. But ultimately, if you can demo something and people are convinced it's worked, hey, well done, you've got angel investor backing. But is that inherently unethical? Well, you have to think about how we've evolved from the time of ELIZA. So ELIZA didn't really fool people, but it got people talking about the Turing test, something that was devised many years before. And so ELIZA didn't really pass the Turing test. But where are we now? I mean, we are at a point where ChatGPT is relatively convincing. I've got hundreds of examples of times I've tried out ChatGPT over the last few months and got it to give me things that could easily have been written by anyone. I've had it invent scripts for kids' TV shows. I've had it write me papers for things. I have tested ChatGPT's knowledge. And yeah, it gets things wrong sometimes, but it does it convincingly enough that you think it's right for a minute. And we have to fact check it. So that's algorithmic intelligence and artificial intelligence. But how does that relate to the real world? And how do we think about things working enough so that it's not really that big a deal, but actually it is a big deal? And the next example, without apparently clicking the wrong button, is hand dryers. How many of you, I'm going to ask this knowing full well I can't see any of you because this is a remote session, but I'm sure lots of you have used one of these before, the Dyson Airblade. This is the first iteration of the Dyson Airblade hand dryer, the kind of revolutionary dryer that you put your hands in like that and it dried your hands, and everyone wanted them because they looked great. And, you know, lots of people were like, yes, great British invention. The guy that runs Wetherspoons really loved it. And, you know, there we go. But these hand dryers were inherently unethical. They worked really well and they dried your hands and they went everywhere. And the fact that there were people complaining that they didn't work was kind of drowned out by the fact that it was good enough to convince the majority of people that they were amazing. If you had darker skin shades, you would really struggle to get one of these Dyson hand dryers to work for you. That's because they hadn't done the right testing. They hadn't really quality checked their product with a diverse enough set of testers. And so their sensors just didn't work very well. They'd built something that hadn't really been done before, a new kind of hand dryer, great. But in innovating, they did not do the required amount of testing, and they didn't think, do we need to test this on people that aren't exactly like James Dyson? Well, the complaints mounted, and rather than make any kind of statement, they released the new and improved Dyson Airblade dryer, and that one worked better. But it was a huge embarrassment for the company. Had they just had some kind of ethical framework, this would not have happened. Very similar things have happened to other companies before. About 8 years ago, HP released a laptop with built-in webcam. They all have them now, but they didn't all at the time. And the bloatware that came with the laptop, some of the HP built-in software, was really revolutionary because it was one of the first bits of software that could do face tracking in your webcam. I mean, it's kind of a given that pretty much any webcam or most pieces of video software will do that these days. But back then it was big, it was revolutionary. They touted it as a great feature until one journalist tried it and it didn't work. And he did some testing and realized that it just couldn't detect people that weren't white. So here you had a fantastic product from HP and face tracking if you happen to look exactly like 80% of the people that work at HP. They didn't have an ethical framework for testing. They released a piece of technology into the world that had an inherent bias to it. And that's interesting because ChatGPT and algorithmic intelligence has those exact same biases because we haven't developed the right kind of ethical thinking before we start building things. And it's difficult to think about doing that because if it's not your job to build or write an ethical framework, then you probably don't have the time to think about it. You are writing a feature or a tool in a piece of code. You're creating a piece of training material. That's your job. That's what you're measured on. You're not measured on having awkward conversations. A lot of people who are doing freelance coding projects or working on something in their spare time also say, well, look, I'm just writing the code. The code works, right? Works for anyone, surely. Does it work on someone who can't necessarily afford a MacBook? Does it work for someone who's maybe using this on a very, very slow connection because they don't have internet in their country? Does it work if there are power disruptions because you're in a country that's currently at war? Does it work for everyone on every platform? Does it do what you want it to do? Are there unintended consequences of the code that you're writing or the things that you're doing? It is a minefield. And it's no wonder people don't often like to talk about the ethics of what they're doing. Because Everyone believes that thinking about the ethics of what they're building is someone else's problem. And no one, save the very, very few incredibly privileged but dearly missed royals, will walk through those minefields. But we all have to be a bit more Princess Diana. And that is probably the first time I've said that in my life. We have to think about how we navigate this minefield and how we move through it. Because it's not just about the things we're working on and the stuff that we're doing in the future. It is about having the vision to think about how the things you're working on could be used. No one can see into the future, but if you're writing something that could be used for nefarious purposes, like, are you creating a tool that could actually power the next wave of autonomous killer attack drones that will come and destroy humanity? That's a very extreme example, but you only have to look to sci-fi. Are you writing something that is going to be used to suppress a group of people or a person? Are you building something that just hasn't been sensitivity checked? And you could be creating a fantastic piece of art. You could be writing a book. You could be creating training material. You could be doing a DevRel session. Have you really thought about the assumptions you're making about your audience? Have you got the vision to think about how this will look in a year's time, in 5 years' time? It's really important to think about the future. And it's not an easy dilemma to fix. The concept of utilitarianism is that actually, never mind upsetting one person as long as there's greater good that's happening. But that's not necessarily the right approach. Utilitarianism isn't an ethical framework in and of itself. It's just the idea that actually the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Can you think of a time recently where a piece of technology was forced on everyone without real choice for the greater good? COVID, the COVID vaccine. I am someone who is a firm believer in vaccines, and I have had all my boosters and everything, but this is a new piece of technology that was rolled out to everyone around the world for the greater good. This was an example of utilitarianism, where the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But there are very few instances where that is a justifiable way of creating something and rolling something out to people. It's really important to think about all of the vision that you have, all of the people that might be impacted by something. So how do you do that? How do you actually start thinking about things more ethically? Because ultimately, by this point in the talk, you're probably thinking, oh crap, I have a huge responsibility on my shoulders and I now have no way to know what to do about it. And I apologize for getting to this point and depressing you all so much with that. But there are so many examples in the world of just thinking, can you expand the code you're writing to include more people? I mean, a fantastic example from a few years ago is the evolution of gender options in online forms. I'm someone who I am trans, and the gender options for me were never very good. I could either select male or female, or man and woman. And now there are a plethora of more options. But even this example here, you can select up to 5 from a list. Is that more or less ethical than providing a free text box for people to just write what they want in? But from a data science point of view, does that mean that the data you're collecting is somehow less valid? Well, you have to think about, why are you doing this? Why do you need that information? Why do you need that data? And this is from a dating website, so it's kind of there for an obvious reason. But if you want to use that data ethnographically later, you have to think about the quality of the data you're capturing. Does that provide an ethical dilemma? And ultimately, this comes down to having a lot of awkward conversations. You might need to say, hello, have we thought about the ethics of the thing that we're building, the thing that we're doing here, the thing that we're working on, to people who may not want to hear that. And if you're working on a project solo, you may have to have a word with yourself and think, have I given any thought to the ethics of people involved in this? And there are some fantastic ways that you can get around this and actually start to have conversations. Obligatory TV shot asking, are we the baddies? So there's a tiny little framework that you can start to use to challenge your own thinking. And that is testing, evidence, discussion, and action. And when I teach this over a long period of time, over a module, there's much, much more depth than this. But as a starting point, as a starter for 10, there are these 4 things you can do in any situation that can start to show you the kind of ethical way forward. So whether you're writing code or writing an article or a tutorial, or you're writing a book, define how you are going to test it. And I don't mean unit tests in code. I don't mean, does it pass debugging? What I mean is, who is this tool aimed at? Are you writing a command line tool for somebody? Are you writing a web app? Are you writing something that will be used on a phone? Are you writing something that will be delivered online or face-to-face? Are you writing something that's a book? Think about how you will test whatever it is you're doing. And if you haven't planned to, make a plan to do testing. And make your test bed as diverse as possible. If you're writing a book, for example, you get sensitivity readers to come and read your book. They're not just proofreaders. They're not just going to check for the spelling, the punctuation, the grammar. They're going to read it and from their experience, from their point of view, say, yeah, you know what? You kind of used a black character here in a bit of a tropey way, and that's not good. You might want to change that. Obviously, you as the author of that thing still have the final decision. But choose a diverse set of testers and make sure you test it on your target audience, even if it's a talk you're giving. Think really carefully about how you collect your evidence as well. Like having a comment in your code or having your iPhone Notes app open is not an adequate way of collecting evidence, especially if you're working in a team. If you're working in a team, you need a collaborative evidence base where you can collect everything together about who your testers are, what people's concerns are, allow people to comment on those, prioritize them in exactly the same way as you would do with code issues. You have to think about ethical issues as equally important. Build up that evidence base, create a little Notion area or something in any kind of shared thing that you have going on to make sure that you've got that front and center and that you and your team can look at it. And if it's just you working on something, always keep an ethics log for whatever it is you're doing. Even if that ethics log is just, yeah, everything's looking good, testers will come back positively. I mean, congrats if that's the case. I don't think I've ever done anything where I didn't have to look back at it and go, ooh, okay, maybe a tweak required there. Discussion is also key. Who is in your circle? Have you got the right people and the right eyes on a thing? If you are working in a team, this discussion point is essential. If you're working solo, then you need to find trusted people that you can talk to. Because even if you're working on a project solo, you will still get up inside your own head. You cannot have a conversation with yourself. You need to discuss these things with people who aren't your testers, with people who aren't hands-on with it, but with people who understand you and the way you think and the way you work. And finally, once you've done that, you've done some testing, you've got your testers, you have evidenced everything, you have had those discussions, you can act, you can decide what you need to do next, what you need to change, what you need to fix, what you need to flag to hire up people. And then you go through the cycle again, because once you've made changes, you need to go back to those testers and say, hey, what about this? Any better? You evidence that. Yeah, it's great now. You discuss it. Hey, great job. No more action needs to be taken. But this is an iterative process that you go through time and time and time again. And it's so important to just have this as a little kind of mental checklist and say, okay, have I arranged good testing? Have I got a place to keep my evidence? Have I got people I can discuss this with? And then when the time comes, what actions have you taken? The only way that we can work more ethically and start to confront the vastness of the question of ethics in technology is for us to confront it and to start thinking about it and start realizing it's not a bad thing. It's okay if something you've written isn't quite ready yet. It's not making you a terrible person by not automatically being the most ethical you can possibly be. Creating an ethical product, whatever that product is a journey. And we're all different. No single person can have all the life experiences in the world. I mean, I'm trans and I'm Jewish, but I'm also white and I'm relatively comfortable. So I know that I don't have all the experiences in the world. I'm relatively privileged. And a lot of people in my circle are relatively privileged. So I have to think, who do I talk to? Where do I go? As a writer, I have a huge network of people that I know who are sensitivity readers and all the things that I need. And it is absolutely okay to rely on them. And it is okay to ask the questions. The worst thing you can do is think, I'm pretty sure this is okay. I'm just going to go with it. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of ethics and technology. Hopefully a bit of kind of a starter for 10 or some food for thought for those of you that haven't really confronted the topic before. I teach this as a whole module, so obviously I could only cram so much into a small talk. But if you look at that kind of initial framework, you start to think about bringing it into conversations you're having and really just start thinking, what are the ethical implications of anything you do? Then you can get somewhere. And is it a pain? Does it add more work? Absolutely. But is it the right thing to do? Arguably, I would say yes. So thank you for listening to me talk about ethics in technology and doing the right thing in a world of hallucinating robots. On the screen there is my social accounts are all at Kestral Rights on whatever. And you can always drop me an email on kes@kesguy.com. Or if you're in East London, feel free to swing by the London Interdisciplinary School and yell at me from reception.